Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. In this episode, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the Russian-Ukrainian war, and specifically in this video, I wanted to dispel a strategy that some people believe the Russians should have executed at the start of the ongoing conflict, the start of the ongoing war. And what that strategy, some people believe the Russians should have executed, was a strategy of cutting off the border of Poland and Romania from Ukraine, thereby disallowing Western reinforcements of equipment, foreign fighters, into Ukraine to then fight the Russian military. So originally, as most of you know, one of the main areas of operations for the Russians was just north of Kiev. The Russians attempted to move south from Belarus, seize control of Chernobyl, Pripyat, continue south, and march into Kiev. Now, we all know what happened. The resistance against Russian forces was much more significant. The real-time intelligence data by the United States being provided to Ukrainian forces, and then again, the level of resistance that some believe the Russians did not anticipate. The alternate plan, some believe, would have cut off Ukrainian ability to be supplied from the West, was if the Russians have moved their forces further to the west and launched an operation south, cutting off the Polish border, and also at the same time moving from Crimea with amphibious landings near Odessa and cutting off Moldova and connecting Transnistria. So why didn't the Russians launch such an operation? If it would have been so effective, if it would have ended the war, why didn't the Russians do it? Well, I'll explain. So first, you have to look at the area. You have to look at the infrastructure that exists, and we're going to do that right now. So if we start from the Polish border with Belarus and Ukraine, this tri-state area, so you have Belarus here, Ukraine here, Poland here. So again, the idea, the concept was that, well, if the Russians moved its forces over here, shot down south, and controlled this border area, the Russians would not be in the predicament it is today. And it's just not the reason I'm about to explain why that would not have worked well for the Russians. And the Russians knew that. That's why they didn't do it. So, first and most importantly, terrain. Very forested, very marshy. Remember the time of the invasion, nothing had frozen over yet. So as we look at this area, and again, we're starting at the tri-state area near the Polish border, there's no roads. And if they are, they're very, very few, mostly dirt roads. But main roads into Ukraine via Belarus, the southwestern part of Belarus, are practically non-existent. So again, what do you see here? Forests. Very dense forests. Let's see if you can actually see a... no. No roads. Small dirt roads. But again, the Russians needed paved roads to move south. So that's reason number one. Again, the infrastructure in this area to support a Russian move to seize control of the border areas, very, very difficult logistically. Much more difficult than what we saw in terms of the Russian buildup north of Kiev. The Russians actually built mission-specific roads and pontoon bridges in this area to facilitate operations towards Kiev. But again, the distance between major concentrations of Russian forces in the east, in Russia proper, much closer than moving forces all the way out here to the northwest, where the infrastructure just doesn't exist. So the infrastructure issue was something that would have been very, very difficult for the Russians. Now, the size of the force that would be needed would probably have to exceed the size of the force that existed in its dash towards Kiev. Remember, they were looking at a decapitation strike. Move south very, very quickly with about 30,000 troops and take control of Kiev. The mission in the west, along the Polish-Ukrainian border, much different. You have a much more rugged terrain area that you would have to occupy. I mean, this area alone, from the Belarusian-Ukrainian border as a bird flies to the entire Polish border, is 185 miles. And then you have all these turns, which is probably going to make it more like 230 miles. Now, obviously, it's control of the road networks into Poland via Ukraine. And that's what the Russians would have tried to control. But what that then does is put the entire Ukrainian military at the back of those Russian forces. So you have Poland here, you have Russian forces here, and then those forces, those Russian forces, trying to cut off this land corridor from Poland into Ukraine is also going to be attacked by Ukrainian forces. It's just not going to be that easy. And furthermore, you're dealing with Western Ukraine. This is the hotbed of Ukrainian nationalism. Many of the most ardent fighters in Ukraine are coming from Western Ukraine. So again, very difficult. And then you take into account cutting off the border with Slovakia, Romania, Moldova. Again, this is a vast area to control. Again, it was very difficult for the Russians just to move from Belarus and do that dash towards Kiev, which again, as the bird flies, 65 miles. And that was brutal on the Russians. And the Russians knew that. They knew that massing forces here and launching an operation to take control of the Polish border would have been much more difficult, both logistically, manpower intensive, and then also facing the Ukrainian military further away from Russian logistical nodes and lines of supply. So a move by Russia to seize control of this area would have been much, much more difficult. Much more difficult. And then finally, again, as we look at possible operations in the south, the Russians learned very quickly that the Ukrainians were not lying down. And it would have been very, very risky for the Russians to launch an amphibious force near Odessa. Because it's highly likely, given what we know now, in hindsight, that the level of resistance by the Ukrainians, in all probability, would have left this Russian force that would have landed in or near Odessa essentially surround it. And the Russians knew that. The Russians knew, and they weren't sure just how much resistance they were going to be facing. And finally, when the Russians crossed the western bank of the Dnieper River, when the Russians drove towards Mariupol, they realized very quickly they were facing a very tenacious and a army that was willing to fight. So again, this concept that the Russians could have just cut off the border with Ukraine from Poland is just unrealistic. It wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have been effective. It would have probably been more catastrophic for Russian forces than the operation that occurred with its endeavor to take Kiev. So I hope that makes sense. But again, logistically, incredibly tough in this area. Much more so than north of Kiev. There's just no roads that lead into Ukraine. Well, what about airborne forces? Well, yeah, they could have used airborne forces. Now, the problem is, again, in hindsight, the issue with Ukrainian air defenses. We know now that Ukrainian air defenses were more robust than quite possibly initially anticipated by the Russians. So in all probability, if the Russians would have launched said operation to cut off the Polish border, it probably would have resulted in a catastrophic failure, unless the Russians would have fully mobilized and launched a multi-pronged operation both at Kiev, at the Polish border, and that would have required 100,000 troops, if not more, while at the same time launching operations in the east. But again, right now, the Russians are mobilizing. So is it possible we'll see something a bit different, possibly directed in that area? Doubtful. I think right now the Russians are really keying on east of the Dnieper River. But I just wanted to explain the rationale and why the Russians did not launch an operation to cut off the Polish and Romanian border. Much, much more difficult. Not an easy task. Much more difficult, much more risky than even its high-risk operation that occurred in the direction of Kiev. So, thanks for joining us today. More to come.